Brenda, thank you. Is that okay for sound?
Yep, you're good.
First of all, hello, I see some familiar faces that stuck around. I still love it. This is like a war of attrition to find who like the absolute gluttons are in here. Like, no, we want some more content. And who are my new folks who are joining us for this session? Okay, just you, my dear, apparently. No, okay, both of you. So welcome to you two. Thank you for coming. Thank you. So I honestly cannot overstate the degree to which I'm just so happy to be here and thrilled to have been invited. And I mentioned before that you can't be a king in your own kingdom, so you may not know that Brenda is extraordinary. And we were just talking about how she single-handedly secured funding for folks to attend here, where professional development is otherwise really not attainable in any meaningful way. So I feel so proud to be part of that. And Brenda, you are a superstar. So thanks for the work you're doing. Like, really. I am so excited to talk to you about this research. And for everyone except for our new guests, this is a little bit of a departure. It's less of a kind of skill building. And maybe for some of you, it's an intellectual exercise and like hearing about an interesting outcome. And for others of you, it will resonate like thinking about what happens downstream of system failure all the way around. So this is families and care providers and medical healthcare systems. So when all things go offline, where do kids end up? And they end up in criminal justice. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our research in Colorado. And I'm going to add some data about juvenile justice. Our juvenile justice data, we have some statewide data in our Division of Youth Services. It used to be Division of Youth Corrections in Colorado, and we have one community corrections partner, Denver Juvenile Probation. And otherwise, our juvenile justice data comes from our partner here in Pennsylvania, Drew Nagel and your BIA PA, Brain Injury Alliance of Pennsylvania. So a huge shout out to those guys who have been extraordinary partners. So we'll talk more about what they bring to the table here. So voila, here's everything that we're going to talk about, too fast and in too great a detail. Still looking for a conflict, but I didn't get any over the break, so go figure. Okay, brain injury. You guys already know these data, but I thought they were kind of stunning. I pulled these data just to get a sense of the scope of the conversation, how big the conversation is here in Pennsylvania about brain injury. So your data, just over 529,000 people here living with acquired brain injury. Your BIA PA has from the work that I've done with them as a research partner and working with them under the umbrella of our Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado, I can say that your Brain Injury Alliance does a really nice job of making eye contact with acquired and traumatic brain injuries. And we have mistakenly, I think, in Colorado, we earmarked as funds, trust funds, now we call it MindSource. We earmarked those funds for services, education, and research on traumatic brain injuries. So my colleague Judy Detmer just this last year had to run a new piece of legislation to get that changed so that Colorado can also serve with these trust fund dollars people with acquired brain injury. But you guys have been doing that for a lot longer and a lot better, frankly. So 98,000 new traumatic brain injuries each year, just over 86,000 emergency room visits. So you know that these data likely underestimate the true frequency of brain injury because people don't go to emergency rooms for all kinds of reasons. And your mortality rate is just over 2,000 people a year. So we're talking about a fairly widespread problem. It crosses demographics. There is a U-shaped distribution where younger kids are overrepresented in older adults, and you see kind of a brief blip in late adolescence, early adulthood. So you guys are kind of in the prime of a population surge in brain injury. So let me just talk to you about some of the adverse outcomes. These go without saying, but I'm going to paint a picture in greater detail about some of these. So the first is criminal justice. So this is where my research has been, my programming really and research has been for the last few years. And depending on the setting, so county jail versus Department of Corrections, community corrections, and gender, the rates are very different. And we're going to detail some of those. But they range anywhere from 25 to 97%. So 27 to 97% of the people in criminal justice settings have a history of significant traumatic brain injury. And I say significant because we're going to talk about how this research is not interested in identifying or really in pathologizing people with an uncomplicated mild injury or a concussion or even several uncomplicated mild injuries. 48% of people who are homeless have a history of traumatic brain injury. We just got funding for a new project in Colorado. So we're embedded for this coming year in a survey called the Point in Time Survey, which is a kind of statewide initiative to assess and run every person that can be identified as homeless through a series of questionnaires to get a better picture of the kinds of resources they use, what are available to them that they don't use, what they may not be aware of, their history of mental illness and substance use. And so this year we're adding also traumatic brain injury and social network. So that rolls out in January for us this year. 60% of people with TBI have also a history of significant substance abuse, and 60% of people with traumatic brain injury also have a mental illness. So this is, and hopefully this will become clear, but this is really a conversation about chicken and egg. So let's say, for example, with substance abuse, the risk for developing a new substance abuse problem after injury is much higher than it is for the general population. The risk that someone who is abusing substances has of becoming injured is much higher. So it kind of becomes this vicious cycle, which you are all familiar with from a clinical perspective. The mental health fallout after injury in particular is really pretty stunning. So for those of you who were in the earlier session, we talked a little bit about these data. So almost half of people with a TBI with no pre-injury history of mental health problems develop a clinically significant problem within 1 year of the traumatic brain injury. And you can see the kinds of problems that includes, for the most part, a lot of depression, but also even to a lesser degree, psychotic or thought disorders. The work that you do bears this out, but 85% of the families and caregivers of persons with a brain injury report that the emotional or behavioral problems for the patient or the client have significant impact on the function of the system. So the kinds of behaviors we're talking about, and substance abuse and depression and sleep disorders, are tremendously taxing for caregivers. So you see this in real time. And when we talk about my research has largely been, with the exception of the few juvenile systems, I work in a lot of adult systems, and what we see is what happens when people burn through all of their social support, right? Like they've exhausted the goodwill of their families and friends and extended family. Suicidal ideation is 7 times higher in people with brain injury than those without. The risk for suicidal ideation persists 15 years after injury. I mentioned earlier that the reason we say 15 years is because that particular longitudinal study is 15 years out right now. So in 10 years from now, that will persist presumably for 25 years. And I'm going to talk about suicide attempt risk later. But the other mortality risks, and I don't mean this to be like such a stunning departure from what I hope is otherwise an optimistic tone. I want to paint a picture of how high the stakes are. So on the mortality risk side, there's a risk from poor death at the time of injury, and there's this unspoken longer-term risk for death for reasons related to the injury. So my colleague at Craig Hospital, Cindy Harrison Felix, is one of the managers of the national, it's called the Traumatic Brain Injury Model Systems database. And these are really detailed data on everyone in the country who receives care for moderate and severe brain injuries. So it has all of their admission data and baseline data. And the TBI Model Systems team calls people, they'll go to their house, they send letters, follow up on an annual basis for the first 10 years after injury, and then I think it's every 2 years. And they assess the patients and their caregivers. So they have this like really detailed data sets. So Cindy's research looked at differences longitudinally between the TBI Model Systems data and equivalent big public health data sets. So she found that on average, for patients who have a history of at least one moderate severe injury, that there was a reduced life expectancy of about 7 years relative to population control. So these are like just the general big data, so big public health data. So if you match people for age, race, and gender, which we know each of which confer unique vulnerabilities, people with TBI history are more likely 49 times more likely to die of aspiration pneumonia, 22 times more likely to die of a seizure disorder, and 3 times more likely to die of suicide. So we have suicide resources there. And interestingly, their risk in the first 15 months after hospital discharge is 7-fold for death. And this includes things like leaving the stove on, or not being seatbelted, and not managing a treatable disease. Yes, sir?
What's the mechanism for seizures?
So a lot of people will develop a post-traumatic seizure disorder. So it's very common after a moderate severe injury to have a seizure disorder. For some folks, right, there's some people in the population who had a pre-injury diagnosis of epilepsy, right, who had a seizure disorder already. Yeah, but it's a good question. So I can't say that there was no pre-injury seizure disease. The other health risks, and I have waxed ecstatic about some of this, so I promise that I have 2 slides here that get a little bit more into the weeds. After traumatic brain injury, remember we see significant atrophy of the hippocampus. So you see volume loss in the hippocampus of the brain, which is the most plastic part of the brain. It shrinks in response to trauma, in response to chronic alcohol use, in response to depression and anxiety, a la PTSD. Another health risk we just mentioned is the development of epilepsy or the development of a post-traumatic seizure disorder.
Are they taking the numbers on children who also have other conditions such as autism? Are they adding these
Excellent.
in?
So these data aren't exclusively on kids. They'd be kids through adults.
And it doesn't matter what they have.
And it doesn't matter what they have. Yep. So this is like compared to public health data. So people with diabetes and seizure disorders and all manner of autoimmune conditions. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So I've never been, I'm a parent.
Yeah.
And I've never been contacted yet. My son in the past 3 years has had significant, because he's a headbanger.
Yeah.
Has had significant concussions. So, but he's also got a chromosomal disorder. He has COL4A1, which is the cerebral small vessel disease.
Interesting.
So he not only has TBI, he also has
Yeah.
the.
Now, here's
But
what's
we've
interesting
never
about
been
your son's
contacted by
case. And we'll talk more about this, but how do you define traumatic brain injury? So for the purposes of our research and programming, we try to capture your son in our data. Your son would not be in the TBI Model Systems data if he weren't hospitalized or identified for care for a moderate or severe brain injury.
Okay, so he has bilateral frontal lobe lesions now from brain
Yep.
injury.
Yes, and was hospitalized at the time for
brain bleed.
for brain bleed
From
or
concussion.
got it. So it may be that he was missed because it wasn't an acute traumatic mechanism.
Okay.
Which is not to say, like, hopefully what you hear me saying is,
Well,
yes,
this
it's
is why it's
traumatic,
interesting
but
for
he's
me.
not in the model
Yeah.
systems database.
So, because he also is autistic as well.
Yeah.
And he has developmental delays. and he's at that age 13, he's now, talking about
Right.
self-harm, like about
Right.
killing himself. He does have sleep problems, and I know like he's at risk for being
Right.
in juvenile
That's
system.
right. And what I hear from you is this totally speaks to you, right? Like this is like you are,
And we
you
never
hear
had
the story about your son.
Anybody at school even help us come back to school.
And in the next 2 days, I hope that you find all of your people here, right? Like this is probably the most powerful moment for you to feel like you have an audience of people who really understand how hard your path is and how hard it is for your son. I'll try to point out every one of the, from a research perspective, every one of the pieces of data that would apply for him. What's unique though is that we don't, as a matter of course, enroll people in research who have, we would consider it almost like a rule out in a clinical trial, right? If someone had a neurodevelopmental disease, that's right, yeah. So what this looks like when someone is injured who has a history of autism or another neurodevelopmental disorder, is really all bets are off. We'd rely on our pediatric neuropsych colleagues to tell us better. But my sense is that it would be an injury to a fragile brain, right? And I say fragile meaning like we don't know, it's unique somehow relative to what we're talking about in the general population, statistically
But in regards
speaking.
to the school team stuff, because it is a concussion, hospitalized for concussion.
Yep.
Should the school-based team not have worked with him to bring him back?
Good question. I can't even speak to it. But we could talk offline after. Yeah, I would really like to. But for TBI model systems, the data set is comprised of people who receive care, right? So they're in a rehab hospital or have an extended acute stay in a medical center. So hippocampal volume loss, epilepsy. We mentioned in the previous session about how high the risk is for the new onset of sleep disorders. Things like obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, pleiosomnia, which means sleeping too much. The risk for neurodegenerative disease is higher, so the risk for developing Alzheimer's disease after a single moderate severe injury is much higher. The risk for, and this is not the conversation we're having today, but the risk for other kinds of dementing diseases like ALS, Parkinson's, CTE is higher after the accumulation of multiple injuries. So theoretically speaking, I think that number is probably thousands, frankly. And then the risk for neuroendocrine disorders is very high. And I was talking earlier about your new cocktail factoid to be like, oh yeah, I totally knew that. So my sense of the field, the neuroscience field with respect to retired professional athletes will be that the conversation will pivot to include more a study of neuroendocrine changes after injury rather than the relatively low base rate likelihood that the person goes on to develop a dementing disease, right? Because that's still the equivalent of getting struck by lightning. We still don't know what accounts for it, right? That's what makes it so scary because we can't give athletes the tools to make informed decisions about return to play or career long, at what point should they leave a career. But this neuroendocrine problem, so in particular pituitary gland dysfunction, account for more of the subjective problems that athletes in particular have. This is the weediest slide, I promise. This is really, do I still have my 3 neuroscience people? Okay. Now it's just the one. Okay. It's just you and me, sister. Okay. Okay. So I mentioned neuroinflammation before, so I won't even go into detail other than for our new guests to say that one of the really characteristic changes associated with moderate severe injury and associated with people who don't recover fully from a mild injury, so a complicated mild injury, is this characteristic pattern of chronic inflammation. So after injury, you have a very brief period of time of acute inflammation, which is a good thing. If we didn't have acute inflammation, we wouldn't heal from any injury. So that includes the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines and the suppression of anti-inflammatory cytokines. And that's short term and for the purposes of healing an injury. In the people who don't recover fully after a mild injury, they have persistent levels of elevated levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines and persistently decreased levels centrally of anti-inflammatory cytokines. It is not unlike the pattern that you see in the gut for depression, for example. So I made the point earlier about how those two things from an inflammatory disease perspective look just the same. As a matter of fact, I won't go into this rabbit hole, but I'll just say that I have a little bit of a tinfoil hat when it comes to talking about like NSAIDs in particular. Don't get me started. But I will say that there is a future, I can imagine, where you're prescribed Advil for depression. Just saying. It wouldn't really be Advil, but some kind of anti-inflammatory medication. Anyway, and for reasons we don't understand, the rate of dementing disease in people who have a history of autoimmune disorders or diseases for which they take not non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, but where they use like prednisone, methylprednisolone, is 0. So like there's something interesting about like the suppression of chronic inflammation. Anyway, so there's this abnormal neuroinflammatory process. The other really interesting thing, and I share this with you because I think it is, it's like one of the emerging areas of inquiry that I think is probably most exciting around brain injury, and it has tremendous potential to inform management of injuries, is that at the time of injuries, one of the physiological changes that happens is that the blood-brain barrier, which is normally a barrier for most things that aren't fat soluble, is temporarily leaky. So we call it a leaky membrane. And it's really the classic mechanism of response to injury. So even in a mild injury, you have a very brief period of time during which the blood-brain barrier is leaky. In those people who don't recover fully to baseline, they have a persistently leaky membrane. And in people with moderate and severe injuries, they can also have persistently leaky membranes. And that opens the doors to all kinds of things getting into the brain that would not otherwise have contact with the brain. So things like bacteria from the gut, for example. So my colleague, who is the neurosurgeon for the Broncos and Avs, he's part of our concussion biomarker research. His medical management of getting any kind of blow to the head is a medication regimen to immediately shut down the blood-brain barrier. Like that's his principal concern. So anyway, watch for that. That's going to get bigger and bigger. But those are some of the physiological consequences of injury. A quick sidebar about the special risks to women for brain injury. So a lot of the research we have has been done on high school and NCAA athletes. A lot of that research has been done on contact sports in particular, so that disproportionately has focused on men. If you look at one of the concussion research powerhouses, so the UPMC folks here, right down the street from you, has almost exclusively looked at male athletes. And Anthony Cantos, who is a good friend and colleague of mine, will tell you the same thing, right? Like, well, I wish we had more women in our studies, but we can assume that our results apply to them. And to which I say, like, who says you can assume that a 16-year-old male athlete looks anything like a 16-year-old female athlete? So we know less about women's response to brain injury, like period, we just don't. And we haven't studied them in contact sports and professional sport paradigms. So what we do know, statistically speaking, is that the rate at which women are persistently symptomatic is higher. So they're overrepresented in the rates of people who have enduring or chronic complaints. So they have more post-concussive symptoms, longer-term disability, more mood problems, particularly depression and suicidality. There is a conversation out there in the world among my colleagues who do research primarily on male participants that would say this is a result of gender roles. Women are more disclosing of their symptoms. They don't have the same bravado. They don't have the brush it off, walk it off machismo that complicates research on post-concussive symptoms in men. To which I say, pshaw, that's like total nonsense to me. because there's so many other things that are different and unique about women. I don't think we can chalk it all up to some like socially constructed gender role norms. Women are overrepresented on either end of the healthcare use continuum. So they're overrepresented if you stratify the top 2% of healthcare users, and a lot of systems will do that to like who are our high users to find out like how do we make them access the system less so they're less costly. So they show up in the emergency rooms a lot, for example, instead of in regular care settings. So women are overrepresented there with TBI. And on the never received care, particularly women with TBI will report that they need mental health care, 50%, but don't receive it. So if the one thing you take away today is to have that conversation with a female colleague or one of your young clients to make the suggestion that they access those services, then you are a force for good. Okay, so that's brain injury in a tiny nutshell. And the audience here, you are more knowledgeable about brain injury than even I am, so I felt like I wanted to add just the inflammatory change and leaky blood-brain barrier to your repertoire. So now you have 2 more things to talk about at a cocktail party, which will be fantastic. And you should talk about the NFL players and testosterone. Okay. So why should you screen for traumatic brain injury in a justice setting? So as a little sidebar, I'll say that there are settings in which you use the term justice-involved individual, which is really my preference, justice-involved individual and returning citizens in the case of people who are being released from community corrections or incarceration back into the community. And there are still professional journals that require you to use the term prisoner and felon. So it's like the world, even the scientific world, is so invested in pathologizing and using these pejorative terms for the people we do research with. So you'll hear me say just justice-involved individuals throughout. So in 2006, there was a report from a group called the Vera Institute. And the Vera Institute is really a think tank of policy leaders that are regarded to be fairly liberal. And they make recommendations to add humanity and to make the criminal justice system more responsive and to promote inmate well-being and to promote better outcomes post-incarceration and better community reintegration. So the Vera Institute has really lofty aims. They also are invested in the environment being safer for correctional personnel, for example. So it's really an everybody wins. In 2006, their report made a suggestion that the criminal justice system should add screening for brain injury to the model intake process so that everybody with a traumatic brain injury would be identified and the kinds of comorbid conditions that we're going to talk more about. So mental health, substance abuse, and that you do training with staff to improve their capacity to respond in ways that promote inmate safety, but also correctional officer and other personnel safety. So all things being equal, we would be doing this work since 2006, but we're not even a little bit. So fast forward to the year, let's see, this would have been in like 2008, that my partners in Colorado get together to start doing this research. And we've exported this model to several states. Pennsylvania has been doing the same work in juvenile justice. And we're still really in the minority when it comes to proactive programming. And I'll talk a little bit about our model, and you could make a decision for whether or not you think that it makes sense to deploy that in other settings. So in the US, the rates of brain injury history in youth corrections are about 50%. So 50% of young men, 49% of young women. Depending on the setting, and I'll share our data soon, 65% of men, 73% of women in county jail settings. For those of you who are less embedded in criminal justice work, county jail, the average length of stay in a county jail settings is about 11 to 14 days. So people go through county jail on their way in, so they're being processed into Department of Corrections, or they're on their way out, right? They're serving a really short sentence for, they had a suspended sentence, or they have failure to appear, or they were non-compliant with a urinalysis or something like that. So it's kind of a high traffic route. 87% of justice-involved adults reported traumatic brain injury over the course of their lifetime. 36% of folks reported a brain injury in the previous year. And when you do the math, right, there are more than 7 million people under the supervision of the justice system. So that includes incarcerated in jails, in Bureau of Prisons, which is the federal system, Department of Corrections, which is the state system, and community corrections, which is parole and probation. So all told, that's about 7 million people. So if you just look at community corrections alone, right, that's a pretty healthy percent. That is like 3.2% of the 7 million, 4.55 altogether. If you just use the 65% math, that is 4.55 million people with brain injury in the system. Our data aren't unique to the US. The same extraordinary overrepresentation of brain injury in criminal justice has been documented in other sister industrialized countries, so in Canada, in France, and the UK, for example. So this comes up in all of those settings. And we can't talk about traumatic brain injury history in criminal justice without a quick sidebar into how dangerous a setting criminal justice is. So this is one of my favorite research studies because it's so elegant in its simplicity. So this is the New York City correctional system, which famously includes Rikers Island. That census has been, right, in response to outcry about human rights abuses. They've been reducing the census there, but Rikers Island has been notoriously dangerous for offenders while they're incarcerated. So they added a brain injury field to the offender health record in the year 2010. So imagine a health record that didn't even allow you to code those kinds of injuries. So they added that field to the offender health record, and then they tracked it over time. So that was their experimental group. So the number of people who were seen in emergency settings in corrections for brain injury. And then their control group is my favorite, it's the elegant part, is the adjacent community emergency rooms. So it's not like compared to rural Iowa, like this is compared to like urban centers in New York City. The rate at which people were injured in New York City corrections was 50 times higher than the adjacent community settings. So it was far and away more dangerous even than any of the current conflicts. So that's Iraq, Afghanistan. It is one of the most dangerous places for people to be. So a lot of folks may not be injured on their way into the system, but they sustain injuries while they're in there. And why do you suppose that happens? Like, what can you guys imagine would be true? It is a bit Darwinian. And how so? Yeah. So in some settings, let's say maximum security, or if you have a psychiatric population, right? So you may have a higher density of maybe higher risk offenders in a smaller place. Yep. Right. So there's a kind of social element to it. So a lot of people, they say this is true for Department of Corrections, not so much for county jails, but you really have to declare an allegiance to one of the prison gangs, right? And people get face tattoos and all kinds of stuff, and get beaten into a gang when you're there. And cells. Overcrowding. Excellent. So it's almost never the case that an inmate has a cell to themselves. So as a matter of fact, like, administrative segregation is like the only option for folks who need to be housed separately. And those outcomes are extraordinarily bad, especially for folks who had any mental health problems before they went in, right? To be housed separately 23 hours a day. So what about your roommate then? So you have 2 or 3 people in a cell. And what's the stuff in the cell made of? Cement, usually, and metal. right? So you have only like hard, immovable objects, and you have kind of an aggressive, angry hotbed, and you have people who may not be great at de-escalating conflict, right? So the ingredients are all terrible. So it is thinking about how high the stakes are as someone goes into the criminal justice system, I think is really important, right? Because it's not just that we punish an offender, it's that we expose them to tremendous risk in there. So our judicial system could do more to protect them on the way in. So why does it matter that you know someone has a brain injury history? So what else do we know about them by virtue of their brain injury history? So persons who are justice involved have all of the expected problems you could imagine in criminal justice. So they are harder to manage while they are incarcerated. So they are, in some cases, a management risk to correctional officers. So they're kind of agitated and easily escalated. They use more health services. They pose a greater suicide risk while they're incarcerated. So that translates into more cost for the system to manage them on a suicide watch. They also have poorer outcomes after release, so they recidivate more often. They have a longer incarceration history, so they spend more time in jail over the course of a lifetime. If you look at people whose injury was sustained during childhood, they go into the system an average of 4 years earlier than people who were injured as an adult. So there's something really unique about this pathway of injury into the criminal justice system. And then what happens to these folks is then they get stuck in there, right? Because the kinds of deficits they have make it really difficult for them to navigate their way back out, right? And for anyone who manages a really complicated work calendar, and maybe you manage the calendar for your family, and maybe you also have a really busy volunteer life, like all of those things require, right, extraordinary frontal lobe function. And for the kinds of deficits we're going to talk about, managing circulating court appearances, and those court appearances get bumped at the last minute, and they have lots of mandatory requirements for therapies and to drop UAs at certain times and to bring their kids to meet with social services at certain times, right? It's really difficult to manage those things and to remain compliant. This is a great study out of Kentucky that represents the interesting dose-response relationship between the number of injuries and the kinds of problems that we're talking about here. So the blue line is no brain injury history. The red is a single injury, and the yellow is 2+. So that is like probably some of the people in the sample had 2, and some of the people in the sample probably had 10 or 12. You can see that the rate at which people get diagnosed with depression, anxiety, thought disorder symptoms like hallucinations, cognitive problems, violent thought, suicidal ideation, and suicide attempt goes up with each one of those successive injuries. What do you know about the risk for sustaining a second injury after the first? It goes way up, right? So it becomes this kind of circuitous loop that can be have really devastating, catastrophic outcomes for a lot of folks. When we are doing this work in criminal justice, and this is true for everybody in the room here too, as we talk about brain injury, you know this, but the rest of the world doesn't know it, that this conversation isn't about learning to treat the brain injury, right? We don't even think it's that big a deal to know that someone has a brain injury history. You have to do something about it. So understanding something about their unique psychosocial vulnerabilities, understanding the cognitive deficits, allow you to make modifications to the way you do things. So in criminal justice, mental health services are delivered in group settings. So there's no such thing as like individual psychotherapy in jails, but they'll do a pretty robust job of going through a manualized group curriculum for relapse prevention or anger management, but you're in a group with 30 plus other inmates in the case of jail. What do you suppose is true if you have an attention impairment, right? Or a memory impairment? The person with a memory impairment sits there and nods and follows along. They look really compliant, like, oh, there's my smiler, there's my nodder, I totally nailed it. And then what happens after the group? It's like, have we met? What? So anyway, here in our model, we're talking about treatment as usual, right? We're not asking for special privileges or management privileges for inmates, but we're training correctional officers how to respond differently, how to view their behavior less as being non-compliant and more as a skill deficit, the can't versus won't. So let me share with you our data. So these are our partners. We had a really remarkable group of partners. I'll just jump ahead and show you, we had at one point 26 partners. So that included community corrections and county jails, problem-solving courts. So we had tremendous buy-in from our partners. And I haven't even shown you our data yet, but I'll say that in our pilot settings, we had 1 year of pilot data from Denver County Jail and 1 year of pilot data from Denver Juvenile Probation. And we invited the correctional staff to send us the folks that they were worried about for evaluation. And when you ask correctional officers, like, who do you think may have a brain injury? Like, our hit rate, which is a terrible term, right? It's like the collision of statistics and criminal justice, because it's like hit rate and capture rate. So it's like, oh, it's terrible. So our hit rate was 97% for jail. So they totally know. But interestingly, for probation officers, 100%. So like if you ask probation officers, like, who do you worry about? Who do you think might have these kinds of problems? Like they know exactly who we're talking about. So we've had some great success in like giving them new tools to manage these folks differently. So, and I have these two in reverse order here. So we had a 4-year HRSA, then ACL grant that funded a program that was designed to screen and identify brain injury history and cognitive impairment. So it wasn't just enough to screen for brain injury history. So brain injury history and cognitive impairment. Number 2, to make a referral for those folks, create a warm handoff into the community for care coordination. So this would be a lot like our juvenile justice model, where you are the downstream of our warm handoff, right? We would hand students, so youth, back into the school system to like a Brain Steps team member. And then the third is to do education and capacity building for all of the stakeholders. So this is everybody from the judges and magistrates to correctional and law enforcement personnel and probation officers to behavioral health providers in the community, and a really robust self-advocacy curriculum for the clients themselves. So I'm going to say more about that, but I will say before we go any further that the most important point, and anyone in here, and I don't see that I'm getting like scowly faces, but I do. I'll say we have had the luxury of some really great press. So whenever an article goes to press, we've had like Newsweek and US News, great coverage of this model. And they always tell the story of one of our inmates, right? So it's not even like a story about like, look at what these ding-dongs in the ivory tower are trying to do in criminal justice. So they always tell like a great story, this redemptive story, and it never fails. And I don't know why people only send mail. Like they truly like hate mail is only mail. Like they don't even email. Like I get probably 10 emails a day from people around the world like with questions, but never angry ones. But a flood of like the kind of that the mailroom brings the plastic box over, right, with like the hate mail, because what people hear is that academics are interested in overturning the criminal convictions of 97% of the people in criminal justice. You guys didn't hear it like that, and I would have noticed because you would have been like laser beam eyes at me up here. But this program is about promoting accountability, and that will become more and more clear. But this is really about changing someone's narrative about themselves, which is a lot like the work that you do with kids who are having trouble in the classroom, right? To change the narrative that they're not stupid. So here's the instrument that we use, and I think you guys may use this in some settings too. So John Gorgen at the Ohio State University has been a long time partner in our research, and we use the Ohio State University Traumatic Brain Injury Identification Method, largely because it is so applicable. It was designed for use in correctional settings and has been really easy for us to embed in the workflow of both intake officers in jails and in the probation officer workload. So there are 5 criteria in the standard OSU. Does anyone use OSU by a show of hands? Anybody? So I have a copy of it here for you guys, and I'll send this to you. So the OSU TBI ID is a 2-page instrument, like front and back. That's important because you will distribute it to your colleagues, and then you'll collect it and have all these single page, like someone ran out of copies and they're like, I'm going to help them out. Do just the front page, and you can't score it with just the front page. So it's easy. It's 5 minutes in the absence of medical records, which frankly, even medical records are not all that great, because if someone wasn't identified as having a brain injury at the time they were seen, or didn't have some totally frank, stunning injury, that may not be the thing that is recorded in their discharge plan, right? Because they had a femur fracture or a lung contusion. So medical records are notoriously squirrely, and we don't have those available to us in 99% of the cases. So one of our pushes in the world is to improve medical documentation, and that's more possible in the settings where you work. So we're really committed, like at the policy level, to getting documentation into your hands, right? Because we're working downstream, like when they don't have it, or they were injured at 16 and now they're 40, and who did they even see at the time? They don't live there anymore. So if we can get it into your hands, then at least we know that there'll be like this objective status record. So without that, you use structured clinical interviews like the OSU, and there's the HELPS and the TBI IQ. There's several different tools out there. We like this one, A, because it promotes a kind of rapport, and B, it doesn't mislead the participant into thinking they know what you're asking about right out of the gate. So it's not a yes/no question, like, do you have a history of head injury, right? If that's, some people may say yes to that, if that's the story they tell about themselves, but most of the folks that we work with are like, nope. And you don't know that they do until you dig a little deeper. So the OSU has successive waves of drilling down into their history. So have you ever been hospitalized? Have you ever been injured at the head and neck? And then you get detail on each one of those events. So what happened? What was the mechanism of injury? How long was the loss of consciousness? Did you get treatment? So you get more and more info. And we modified the scoring to have just 3 criteria. It is a terrible tool if you use John's scoring. So just FYI, you should tell him I said that. But don't say I said it like that. But anyway, this is the copy that you have here is the scoring that we've modified, and we've published using these scoring criteria. So it's not even just like made up, like which half of what I do is made up. So I'll at least point out when it's not. Okay. So the scoring criteria, so this is to be identified as having a significant brain injury history. They have to meet 1 or more of 3 criteria. So the first is that they have any loss of consciousness before age 15. So first, worst, multiple. It's in a different order there. Research suggests that kids who are injured with a loss of consciousness are more likely than adults to have longer-term post-concussive problems. So we want to flag kids who are at risk, or adults who are injured as kids because they have accumulated more risk. So any injury with a loss of consciousness before age 15. Worst is any moderate severe injury. So this is any injury with a loss of consciousness of more than 30 minutes. And then multiple, which is no end of trouble to research correctly, because I think it's like such a garbage criteria. Like there's just no good way to define it so that it's measured consistently well, where you don't miss people or you have too many false positives on the other side. So right now, we've defined it as 3 or more injuries with altered mental status or 2 injuries within a 3-month period. The spirit of the multiple criteria is to flag people who are exposed to repeat injuries. Principally, we're picking up a lot of women who are exposed to interpersonal violence in this criteria. They don't talk about their history as being like, well, I have a head injury, but they do talk about their history as being beaten to unconsciousness like every Friday night when he would come home from drinking with his friends, right? Like their story is about multiple brain injuries on an ongoing basis. We're not hoping to flag kids who played contact sports, right? Who like got their bell rung a couple of times in, the course of a, high school athletic career. And it's hard to define the criteria in a way that doesn't rule people in who really don't have increased risk for poor outcomes, or to unintentionally miss someone who may be at risk for poor outcomes. So right now, for the purposes of our scoring of this instrument, my comfort level as a researcher in publishing this was that I preferred to err on the side of including people who may not need the services at the risk of missing anyone who really did need it. Does that make sense? So that my threshold went in that direction. We do a lot of research with our statewide database, our jail-based behavioral supports data, JBBS, and they have a single question that is embedded. Our state Medicaid system also has a single question. We call it the CCAR. So Pennsylvania and maybe the school systems have something like that. Like, do you have a head injury? Yes or no? And there's really great research out there that suggests that if you just ask that question, you're wrong about half the time. So about 42% of people who actually do meet the criteria as having a significant injury answer no to a simple yes-no question. So there's an instrument, and again, right, revised, scoring is revised for Colorado. The second piece, and this is my favorite piece, which has been the totally impossible part to offload without external funding, is the neuropsychological screening or cognitive screening. My gift to the world in my whole career is that I have trained 20 years of psychology students to write a 2-page neuropsych report. I know, see? Come on, I don't have really any claim to fame except for that. And I don't know, frankly, that it will make a difference in the long run, but my beef with the field is that we write these unwieldy reports that not only don't even answer the referral question, but they're really like a projective test of how smart we are. Look at all of these smart terms that I could use in this report. And I, as a professional, I do a lot of consulting with like our disability student services, for example, who have to email their reports to me to say, like, we got this report from so-and-so in the community. Could you just tell us what kind of academic accommodations this college student needs? And I'm like, okay, here's 27 pages of nonsense. Like, I think it's extended time and a scribe, okay, right? Like, so anyway, so the neuropsych screening generates 2 work products. So the model that we had, like our Cadillac model, is that a student clinician meets with an inmate or probationer on one occasion to do a 2-hour neuropsych screening battery. And that includes a really exhaustive clinical interview, one of 2 neuropsych screening batteries, so a computerized, the ANAM, which is my favorite computerized neuropsych battery, which is really strong down to age 12, just FYI for you guys, and Vista Life Sciences, who is our research partner, has a long history of making it available for free in settings where there aren't funds. So we've never paid for it in any of our criminal justice settings or our community clinic, and I know that they would do the same for you guys in schools. In the neuropsych assessment, NAB, battery screening module, is my favorite paper and pencil screening module. We also added 3 effort tests. That's partly because I'm an academic, and when we did our first pilot test, we were getting clearance from the Denver County Sheriff to come into the jail and rotate 40 students meet with inmates. And we got him to agree, and he was like, well, that's fine, but I've got to tell you right now, like, they're just going to lie their faces off. And I was like, okay, well, we'll put effort tests in there, which are terrible from a methodological standpoint. But we use 3 of them, which is this forensic model of using 3. Like, they have to pass all 3 effort tests for us to use their data. And our effort test failure rate is 8%, which is the same as, like, the general public. So take that, Denver Sheriff Diggins. Anyway, but that's the world, right? Like, they face tremendous prejudice. So the students would do a 2-hour screening battery with the inmate, and then they would come back in 2 weeks for a feedback session. During that time, the student wrote a 2-page report for the system. So if we were writing for the jail, we might write to correctional officers or the community reintegration planner or the mental health provider at the jail, whoever was the relevant audience. And the report really emphasized, like, given this inmate's deficit in blah, 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 or their relative strength in this, they're going to have a hard time doing X, Y, and Z, and here's what you're going to do about it. So really tangible. And I'm happy to share example reports with anyone who wants to use this kind of model. And then also, so the inmate or probationer would really never see that report, typically, right? They could get a copy of it, but it's not written for them. So then the student clinician also wrote a feedback summary for the inmate or probationer. So this was written for them, and sometimes it's a letter. Sometimes if literacy was identified as being a problem, then it was like, a series of graphs and examples. And if it had, if your suggestion, the student clinician's suggestion was, they have a memory deficit, so they should be encouraged to write things down, then the feedback summary might have lines on the back of it, and the student would turn it around during the feedback session and say, like, hey, one of the tools that I really want to encourage you to use is to write things down, because I noticed that you mentioned that you don't think you remember things well, and I see exactly what you're talking about. You really don't remember things well. So let's practice that, right? And have them write it down, summarize in real time. The feedback summaries, I cannot overstate, and you think like, oh, big deal, like how important can that be? It is shocking how special it is for people who are involved in the justice system to have anything that's personalized to them, first of all, right? Like they're just never going to have an audience for 2 hours with any health professional ever, right, for any circumstance. But to have these tools changes their whole way of thinking about themselves. And how do you guys imagine that to be? Like, what was their narrative before they heard about cognitive function? Stupid. I'm totally stupid. I'm useless. I just know that I'm no good. Right? My parents are ashamed of me. Right. They've accumulated all those labels, and it defines them, right? I just know that I'm kind of a screw up, right? That's the only thing I know about myself. Yeah, I'm really not good with relationships. I screw it up for myself every time. And everybody's got that same kind of story. And then you hand them these data to suggest like, boy, I see exactly what you mean. You really are terrible at this. But look at this other thing that you do relatively well, and here's how we're going to leverage that to compensate for a memory deficit or attention deficit or processing speed deficit. Does that make sense? And the self-advocacy piece is so powerful. Like we've seen it turns people around, right? To go from thinking like, I'm just a pile of brokenness to like, no, this is on me, right? Like I'm not going to remember stuff. So the one thing I know is I have to ask for paper, so I write everything down. Does that make sense? It like puts the ball back in their own court, and it's been really profound. And I will share with you guys some anecdotes. I'll send one link. This is, we had a gentleman who he sent an email at one point, like the subject line was Dr. Kimberly Gorgens, so I knew he didn't know me at all. I was like, well, anybody knows I don't go by Kimberly, unless I was in trouble. So Dr. Kimberly Gorgens saves suicidal inmate. And it just said that in the subject line. I was like, whatever. So nothing. And then it was like a year goes by, and this gentleman, Markel Taylor, next sends me an email with this piece of legislation that he'd written to fund a statewide system to screen for brain injury and cognitive function for all of the persons in Department of Corrections. And so I was like, and it was like terrific. It was like this totally lovely, like he'd used, a template and really made a go of it. But I didn't know who he was. So I just like Googled like, okay, let's see. And he had this YouTube video that was like this clandestine video that someone had taken of him testifying at court for a friend of his who was being sentenced. And he was talking about how somebody had a conversation with him about how he could fix it. And that's all he needed to get out of the system after 24 years, and how powerful it was, and could the judge please also give him a brain injury evaluation. Of course, the judge had to be like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but that sounds great, and I wish I could do that. But this gentleman, then, he's come with me on several other occasions to talk about his experience. Being told you're not broken is a game changer. Okay. Second aim, referral for support. So the warm handoff. So here in Pennsylvania, you guys have the Brain Steps teams on the youth side. So our Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado works with Brain Steps teams on the youth side. But for adults, this is a warm handoff to someone who will be the hub of services in the community. So what we have found, this is our capture rate. This is the other unfortunately named statistical term. Our capture rate, so the rate at which people are referred to services and make contact, is much higher among people where our care coordinator went to the jail or went to the court to meet them, right? Like, hi, I'm Jamie Horsfall, here's my number, how can I reach you? Okay, you don't have a cell phone, where are you gonna be? Can I have your mom's telephone number, right? Like Jamie will do whatever to find out how to reach them. And the rate at which they stay afloat has been really high. And we're looking right now at official judicial outcomes, but I can talk a little bit more about that. The care coordination for adults has been remarkable. The care coordination and referral, the relationship with the Department of Ed on our side has been really extraordinary to make the connection for people to an education consultant who can help facilitate their reentry into school has been really important. And you can imagine that would be important for kids who are coming out of either youth corrections or who've been out of school temporarily, like while they're going through the adjudication process, and they may even just be on probation, but to come back into school can be a pretty big deal. So that person whose responsibility it is to ease their way and to make sure that all of the stakeholders are on board and support their progress has been really remarkable. And then this is just a picture of our service network with MindSource, which is our renamed Traumatic Brain Injury Trust Fund, which is the group that funds Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado's care coordination services, which again, right now is limited only to folks with traumatic brain injury. Next year will be open to everybody. The third aim, education, has been primarily on the provider side, judicial education. So we have COs, correctional officers, POs, probation officers. We also have behavioral health folks and case management, community reintegration. We have on the juvenile justice, we have a lot of magistrates in the juvenile justice side. And then our other aim on the education side has been self-advocacy. And that's what I'm more excited about to share with you, because we have, I think, a totally rocking curriculum to share. So we built this 7-module curriculum for persons identified as having a brain injury history. We built it as a group, a facilitated group curriculum. So we've been offering this in jails and problem-solving courts for now is 6 years. And they offer it weekly. So they'll have, we could start at number 1 and go through 7, but people kind of pop in and, they could start at 4 and then they just make the circuit, right? They stay past 7. And it's been great. And people come in for tune-ups, like they really appreciate the peer support that is the group. And in a way that I thought was going to be totally garbagey, we couldn't really meet the needs, so we decided to create an online curriculum. And I was like, pfft. Because what I knew was that people really responded to the peer dynamic in the room. And it was like this totally lovely kind of encouragement and social support network. And I thought, well, we'll never be able to reproduce that. And that really, I think, is the secret sauce of why it's so important. So we put it online. And now people prefer the online version. And they love it. So it's now yours for the taking. It's totally free. It's right now, we have the adult curriculum online. We have a juvenile curriculum written, and I can share that with you guys too. And we'll load the juvenile. It's really just like changing the wording to be better reflective of a kid's experience. So this is the AHEAD model, achieving healing through education, accountability, and determination. And it's been incredible. Like I said, I totally assumed that the online version was like, ticking a box to like, well, we could at least pretend that we tried that so that when it doesn't work, we could defend not continuing to do it. And turns out it's even more, it has better impact. I'm mindful of people who hate the word impactful. Do you guys know any of those people who are like, that's not a word? It is a word, but okay. Brenda's like, don't use that word. So has bigger impact. Okay, so let me share with you some of our Colorado data. All of that run up. So this is super tiny, and you really can't see it. But we've screened just about 4,500 people across Colorado. And these are some of our different partners. So in each one of the counties, we'll have several different partners, so different problem-solving courts in a single county. But anyway, these are the categories of all of our partners. And then you could see the brain injury, the positive brain injury rate. So this is using the OSU criteria that I mentioned earlier. So we're ruling out uncomplicated mild injuries and ruling in just those first worst multiple criteria. So some of the ones I want to point out to you. So one is we had, and we have been really deliberate about enrolling as many women as possible into the program. So we have about 30% women, but we had one site, this was in one county problem-solving court for repeat female offenders. So this is a smaller group, but this was 31 women and 30 were positive for significant brain injury history, and that's the same percentage that we found in the rest of our research. The other notable piece of data is for Denver juvenile probation. So I'll show you some of our initial data later, which suggested this number was higher. So 445 kids screened, and our positive traumatic brain injury rate was 18%, and which is lower statistically than in some other states. And the rate in our Division of Youth Services was 50%. So it could be that kids with more significant impairments are more likely to be represented in corrections, right? So those kids are downstream of juvenile probation. And these kids have fewer deficits, or, right, those kids haven't accumulated the kind of injuries that would create the kinds of problems we're talking about here. Our overall rate, if you include juvenile offenders, is 45% across all of our settings. If you look just at adults, it's 54% positive traumatic brain injury rate. And you guys know that number for significant brain injury history is like less than 5%. So some of our data from the secondary screen, so this is from that neuropsychological evaluation. So in our model, people who were identified as having a significant history were referred for this 2-hour battery. So we weren't evaluating folks who didn't have a brain injury history. So just as of this month, and we have 46 more records in the hopper to code now, but as of earlier this month, 934 people, like I said, about 30% female. The traditional overrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities that is true of the justice system in general. And we had a little bit more better representation, maybe this is sadder representation of veterans in jails than is true in the Colorado census. One really stunning piece of data from the folks that we've interviewed in criminal justice. These are CDC data for mechanism of injury. So importantly, you guys all know that the most common cause of injury in the general public is falls. So that is falls from a height or falls down the stairs. And assault is about 2% in the general population. So in a criminally involved population, 74% of all of the injuries they report were related to assault, 12% to motor vehicle accident, which is much higher in the general public, a higher percentage of motor vehicle accidents in the general public. Very few falls, 11%, and then 2% blast injuries, largely because of our 10% veterans. And then this is the most important slide, I think, of the whole presentation, and it's so jumbled up here that it really should be 20 slides, but this will keep me from spending hours and hours here. So this is a picture of, I call it the psychosocial vulnerabilities, but this is really a picture of how complicated a presentation these clients have. And this is what I hope you'll hear is this is the kind of circumstance that you find yourself working with the really difficult, challenging cases. So these are folks, all of whom have a traumatic brain injury. That's why we screened them. 60%, 60, were the victim of childhood violence. That number in the general public is 15%. 62% have been assaulted as an adult. In the general population, that number is 2%. What's really stunning is that when we asked about suicidal ideation, it was 100%. So that seemed like kind of a wash. When you ask about at least one suicide attempt, it's 39%, or almost 40% of people have attempted suicide at least once. 54% have a history of at least one school suspension, so they've all crossed through your offices at one point. This is where the picture gets a little bit more crisp in terms of that complicated comorbidity. 96% of folks in criminal justice with a traumatic brain injury also had a significant history of substance use. 77% had at least one mental health diagnosis, so significant mental illness. In our population, 57% of folks had mood disorders, about a third anxiety disorders, 13% psychotic disorders, so more than is true post-TBI in the general public. And the standard approach to managing psychiatric distress in jail is medication management. So almost 2/3 of folks were taking medication, 57%. And when you looked at the rate at which someone had TBI, 100%, and also comorbid substance use and mental illness, that number was 74%. So I started talking about this 74% number as the superfecta, because like trifecta would be 3. So these are folks who have traumatic brain injury history, right? So with all of the vulnerabilities and the cognitive deficits that includes. They have significant mental illness, significant substance dependence, and criminal history. So it makes, like, from a clinical perspective, these folks are so hard to manage. It's hard to even wrap your brain around, I don't even know where to start, and how do I get them a job, and how do I get them health care so they can manage their health problems? It's really complicated. And if you zoom back, right, we're way downstream of where you guys are. So if you zoom way up the time frame so that this is the first time they hit your office, or the first time a teacher complains about them, or the first time they have a behavioral problem on the playground, wherever for littler kids, right? Like they don't show up in our data if we can better support your management of them way upstream. And then this is just a little bit of that same picture by specific diagnosis. This is that link to the TED Talk, and this is not like shameless, like you should go see this TED Talk. But the backstory, I tell the story of a couple of our participants, and in the video, they keep panning to the same like audience view, and it's like, was it just those few people in there? But so I tell a story. One of the stories I tell is about Thomas, and it's Thomas that they're cutting to in the audience. So like the backstory, you could watch it and be like, oh, that's a guy watching his story on the stage. And then the behind the scenes, just after my talk, we invited him, and it was second gentleman, but Thomas to stand, and it was like 4,000 people gave him a standing ovation. It was like there wasn't a dry eye in the house for real. But anyway, so check that out if you want to hear Thomas's story. So that's our adult and a little bit of juvenile justice data. So is everybody hanging in okay? You guys are the best, literally the very best. I could literally stay here until 10 p.m. doing this, so I won't. That's not like a threat, but it makes me so happy that you guys are hanging in there. So here are some of our juvenile justice data. This from our juvenile probation and from your colleagues here in Pennsylvania, Drew Nagel, M.J. Schmidt, et al. When you look at lifetime history, the numbers vary depending on the acuity or the security that the setting offers. So, for example, you have settings that are much higher, right? So probation is lower than incarceration settings in juvenile justice for Pennsylvania. Our numbers, this was halfway through. So we had 199 people. Our number was 33%, which struck me as a little bit high. So we went back through and recoded the interviews, and that's where we ended up with 18%. So maybe I artificially deflated that number. The average number of brain injuries, so in Pennsylvania among adults, so in Colorado, our number was 6, which is stunning. The Pennsylvania number was just over 4. So importantly, the number of brain injuries reported by kids in the juvenile justice system was 3 in Pennsylvania and 4. So getting up there. So again, they get to 6 by the time they are an adult. The age at time of injury, this looks a lot like that CDC population curve where you see like a little blip mid-adolescence. So for a lot of you who are in like junior high, middle school settings, these are the kids, right? Their risk for injury is really high. What I would take this slide to mean is that the stakes are higher, that you could catch them and like manage their sequela better in a school setting, and then they never have to show up in our research, either in Pennsylvania or what if they move to Colorado? Then they show up in our data in Colorado. Mechanism of injury in Pennsylvania, more falls, but you do start to, in both states, start to see an overrepresentation of assault-related injuries. So remember, in the general public, CDC data, this number is 2%, so much lower. For care, does the youth receive care at the time of injury? For whatever reason, I think this is a credit to public education here and the kind of outreach that you do. Kids in Pennsylvania are much more likely to get onto the official radar of someone, right, which is important largely because this is the way that they could make referrals to your teams, right? This is the way that we can educate parents or caregivers about what to expect so that they can manage those problems. And then Colorado was much less likely to have seen anyone for care. Before we go on, does anybody see folks in your setting, like post-injury and worried about downstream circumstances? Like, can anybody remember a case where you thought, like, man, if the wheels come off this bus, this kid is like an express train?
Sure, especially in our poverty
Right.
hospitalization or any type of ongoing care. So when you recommend all of these different types
Right.
of therapies, they're not getting them.
Totally.
And then they start with, they're much more permissible when it comes to not showing up at school. It's tough.
Right. It's like there's one wheel off the bus, right? And then you have like peer rejection is the second wheel off the bus, and then you have hanging out with this is in the psychopathy research, association with antisocial peers, right? It's like one of the biggest risk predictor for kids to get into the juvenile justice system. Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate that. Like you can see it coming to a person with some kids.
Where does parent denial fit in?
Oh, what do you think?
I don't know, because the area where I'm from, I see a lot of, it's a cultural thing.
Yeah,
Where it's, oh no, that's just not happening.
right.
But it is in the cultural aspect.
Yeah. And really powerful too, right? Like I may really need to tell myself that this is going to be okay or this is no big deal. And for a lot of folks, you do walk it off. You guys have probably heard those stories that are like so shocking of in Colorado, you hear like thrown from a horse with like a 2-day loss of consciousness where they were like camped on the couch at their house. You know, like the kind of thing you think, did nobody worry? Like what happened? I don't even understand. You know, like I'm the person who's like, he has this bump on his leg. You know, so it's not at all, you know, I like go straight to hysterics, but you're right? Like there's a really powerful incentive to believe that this is a non-issue for a lot of folks.
There was a situation where I'm from where there were two girls that were fighting. Girl A won the fight, girl B lost. Girl B's mother made her come back the very next day to whoop girl A.
Oh,
They both
yeah.
ended up with head injuries, but mom egged it on.
Yeah,
But then mom denied the injuries.
right. In the picture I want to paint is that all of those things contribute, right? Like brain injury is almost in some of these cases like a cherry on top of really impossible circumstances of exposure to childhood trauma. And, you know, in some cases you could think about, and maybe not in that case, but, you know, it's also bad parenting and it's absent parenting or permissive parenting. It's substance abuse, peer rejection, right? It's all of the above, right? Not being able to de-escalate verbal conflict is a big deficit that gets kids into trouble.
Does a data support, because obviously, you know, mental health, sleep issues, you know, there could be other trauma involved.
Yep.
Does the data support that during the evaluative process for special education, that this should be something that should also be part of the comprehensive?
Oh, for sure, on
But it
special
isn't.
ed. But you guys don't have that in your special ed.
No, it's not
Evals.
comprehensive.
Should traumatic brain injury be identified during the evaluation for special education services?
Particularly with change in behavior.
Yeah, it is, not enough.
Not enough sometimes.
I work in a lot of counties.
Yeah.
And I've never seen it.
If Brenda had her way, it would always be a yes, right?
Well, and I would like to see it as a yes too,
Yeah.
particularly with children who have now suddenly got these behavioral issues. Everybody says, oh,
Yeah.
it's ADHD.
Right.
But yet they had a 3-day concussion
Yeah.
in the hospital
Right.
playing football.
And it's almost a double-edged sword. I can remember our school-based brain injury services previously were not embedded in the special ed team for a reason, right? We thought like, well, they're probably identified once they're on the radar of special ed, but this way we get to identify the kids who would otherwise never ping on someone's radar. But then we found that the system wasn't as responsive to conversations about brain injury. And so now that we're under the umbrella of special education, like they get us, right? But I worry that we miss some kids.
For a county's children and youth.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of reports.
Yep.
I mean, one child who had actually been taken from the home had repeatedly suffered brain trauma from beatings.
Yeah.
Was identified as emotionally disturbed.
Yep.
under a conduct disorder through
Yeah.
school, and we totally miss the
Right.
mark on him.
Well, this is the worry if you are looking just at cognitive performance, right? Is that you're going to miss the kids whose chief deficits are behavioral, right? Or conflict de-escalation or interpersonal relationship. Yeah, that's excellent.
Because a report doesn't, I mean, an evaluation doesn't harm a child.
That's right. It's easy to add that. Yeah. Yes. And I hope everybody will think about, like, does the OSU make sense?
Process
Yep.
To put that down as
I
well.
love it. Love. There was one other hand back there.
I was saying I just encountered this in, not my district, but another. But anyway, a child was actually ready to graduate and has diagnosis of autism, has had a lot of behavioral things, but is a chronic headbanger and definitely has had
Oh,
Cumulative.
concussions. However, the special ed team, the districts are really reluctant to look at or even consider TBIs for those kids.
That sounds
so interesting. And when I do like provider education, my point about identifying a brain injury is it doesn't give you a lot, right? It doesn't say like, well, I know this about the person. I talk about it as if the only thing you know is traumatic brain injury history, it's almost like a clinical shorthand for like, well, then I know their risk for childhood trauma and peer rejection and academic problems and risk for substance abuse, right? The things that you worry about for your kids is much higher, right? Suicidal ideation, suicide attempt. So it becomes almost a proxy for risk, right? It kind of flags a kid for you guys like, well, I have to watch this kid with a little bit more intensity than I might have otherwise. But it strikes me as so foolish. Like, well, I don't want to identify a kid. So importantly, and this is true in the world of neuropsych too, right? It's not the diagnosis. So first, neuropsych, I think, we're not doing evaluations for the purpose of diagnosing brain injury. The mileage is in like, what can they do and not do, and what are we going to do about it, right? Like, how do we better support this kid? But the idea that the label carries stigma in a system that really should be responsive and the label should confer care is like, it's so sad. It says we should fix the system and not, suddenly use labels less frequently. Yeah, makes me sad. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is related, but it's kind of getting deep that time of day. But my husband is a teacher, and he used to teach in a juvenile detention center.
Yeah.
And he also used to teach in a county prison. And he swears, and this is total anecdotal.
Yeah.
But he swears that the vast majority of kids or inmates that he worked with have reading disabilities.
Sure.
And so that, if you kind of, you're
And that's chicken and egg too.
yeah, I thought that the cherry on top
It-
of this whole, the tip of the
Totally.
that's a big factor.
Yeah.
And we're, the state's always telling us we're over-identifying because that means they have to pay more money. for
Yeah.
special ed. But
I know.
happens, and and
You're
it's
totally right on.
another reason for them to feel like a piece of crap.
Totally.
about themselves.
Yes. And the data unequivocally say that the rates at which kids with learning disabilities are injured is higher, and the risk for an acquired learning disability after injury is much higher. So just like substance abuse and everything else we're talking about is just the same thing. Does removing the label of TBI make them cheaper? No, right? It's like, hey, the TBI just said, hey, this kid is a risk for academic failure, for developing a substance use problem, for being a harm to themselves. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the cognitive piece is for me, right, and you too in neuropsych, like it feels like this is like easy low-hanging fruit, right? At least we know how to jump in there and accommodate deficits and maximize performance using compensatory skills. Yeah. So it feels like such a miss when we take it off the table.
Yeah, you've got to identify them first.
Right, that's right.
As was mentioned in that, a lot of these people just don't have access to the resources.
That's right. So that's a brilliant segue to, okay, what are you going to do about it? We haven't had funding for our model for now, we're coming up on the end of 2 years with no funding. So I promise to you, I'm like talking a good game up here, like, look at we have all this money and this expensive stuff we're doing. But we're like so scrappy for free stuff. Like we don't have any money to do any of this. So you're getting everything from me that is free for free. And even if I didn't have it to give to you for free, I would still give it to you for free. I just don't have anything that isn't free because that's how we cherry pick. So here's some free stuff that you could deploy in whichever settings. Embed this in whatever workflow makes sense. So it could be at the time at which a kid is handed to you from a care setting. So they were seen in urgent care or an emergency room. So that's kind of an obvious one. But maybe after a fight, right? You know that somebody got in a fight, or the moment at which they have, they bump into academic trouble or substance abuse for the first time, which is a whole other issue. But the substance piece, that TBI in a lot of ways is analogous to our approach for substance use, which is to like bury our head in the sand. So I don't know if this is true in Pennsylvania, but we did a statewide survey wearing another hat on substance use. We did a statewide survey to look at the substance abuse policies for schools. And with 2 exceptions, the first line item on every single policy was suspension expulsion. And the 2 exceptions were like refer for care, suspension, expulsion. And in TBI, it's kind of the same thing. Like, well, surely that's somebody else's problem. Like, we should like put that onto their radar. And then when that kid's ready to learn, they can come back into my wheelhouse. It's so silly, right? Like, well, of course they have needs that you can meet.
Well, we're showing those kids that they're disposable as well.
Right, sure. It does send a really powerful message. That's right. So use the lifetime history screen, the OSU TBI ID, or any one of the other screens. HELPS, TBI IQ are 2 chief among them. We have that neuropsych screening training. So I have modified the screening battery that we did to fit the scope of practice in most states at the master's level. So we have an online training program that teaches master's level behavioral health clinicians to use a neuropsych screening battery and to generate data that ultimately can be used for treatment planning or educational planning purposes. So this is a link. It doesn't work here on the screen, obviously, but you'll have a copy of that. You could also Google like neuropsych screening Gorgens and get that. It's a totally asynchronous online course, and we could offer you guys scholarships to attend that, if that would be helpful. And voila, this is the better version. I mentioned in the last talk, we were talking about the self-report questionnaire. So this is the current iteration. Recognizing that we don't have the capacity to do a 2-hour neuropsych screening battery on all of the kids and adults who really need it, we designed this symptom checklist, self-report symptom checklist, to flag the behaviors that we heard a lot about from our clients. So we designed the survey to reflect what we heard from our 900 something people. And we designed the tip sheets to reflect the kinds of problems that people run into, the trouble that they get themselves into. So remember that you have, and I just resent it again, so it sounds like those handouts will be posted sometime soon. So you have a copy of the symptom checklist that looks fancier, so it looks like this one. So you have that. You can make copies of that and use it. The online scoring is coming soon, so hopefully that is anytime now. And then you get, this has not been adapted for youth yet, but it will be between January and March. You get 3 sheets for each one of the deficit areas, one for the client, so in your case it would be the kid, you could modify it really easily, that promotes self-advocacy. Each one of those bullet points is empirically supported, so this is some technique or accommodation that has demonstrated utility in addressing that deficit. You also get a tip sheet for mental health professionals and a tip sheet for criminal justice professionals. So what we'll be doing in January is developing, tweaking the language of the symptom questionnaire to reflect kids and developing a corresponding tip sheet for educators. So watch this space, that's coming soon.
The counselors in schools?
Yeah, it's totally free. It's all yours, and it will be posted sometime soon. The educator piece, the educational curriculum, so this would be tip sheets for students, so it would have like a little bit more, right, like the language would be more what you're gonna run into, will be available to you by March. Yeah, but these tip sheets are all available to you now. Yep, totally free, yours for the taking. So you have all of those resources, and a quick shout out to the previous presentation, like what was the most important resource that everybody gets? Sleep. Oh my God, you guys, I really will stay forever. Okay, so just batting cleanup, so a few resources I want to make sure that everybody has and bookmarks. So the first is that self-paced curriculum. So this has those 7 modules. And we have the juvenile justice one that we have a written curriculum for, which I will share with you, and the adult curriculum is online. So I'll talk to Judy Detmer about putting the juvenile curriculum online. But my colleague, Judy Detmer, felt really strongly, so I had a hand in doing all of these like skill-based deficit accommodation, and Judy was like, don't you think we should make eye contact with like the emotional adjustment to injury, or like having a conversation about brain injuries? So because Judy is right about everything in the world, we added this 7th module, which is grief. We call it grief, but it's really psychosocial adjustment to having an injury. So again, not with the intent of cementing someone in a status of like, well, now my brain doesn't work the same, so I kind of give up, but instead to talk about normalizing that experience and promoting then a sense of mastery over recovery. The other resource I mentioned earlier is our colleagues at the MyRec, the Denver VA. They have a special tab. They built these materials in the same ACL grant that we have. So they have kind of TBI basics, which can be really helpful for you guys as you're doing, let's say, a professional development. You're hosting a PD lunch for your peers. So there's great materials that you can download for free from the MyRec. The comorbidity between mental illness and TBI, justice involved, so specific tip sheets for people in the criminal justice system, and then military veteran specific tool chest. Then we have the Co-Kids with Brain Injury, which looks a lot like the kind of resources that you guys have here with Brain Steps. I really cannot say enough. In the same way that I feel like Brenda should be celebrated until the end of time, our pediatric brain injury team and Heather Hotchkiss, who heads up our Brain Steps in Colorado, are really extraordinary. And the work that we've been doing with adults and with juvenile justice is so far downstream of the sweet spot. And you guys are the sweet spot, right? Like we wish that a teacher had really appreciated how high the stakes were, or that someone had had a conversation with someone's parent at the time of injury, or better supported them when the student was driving them crazy because they suddenly seemed like they were totally off the rails and were unrecognizable to them. So the work that you're doing is so imperative so that people don't show up on our radar. I mentioned before John Corrigan's accommodation booklet. He will make big stacks of these, 50 and 100 at a time, available to you guys for free. And this is really super simple stuff. Like it's like, stop think, act, right? Like it has the stop sign, and it's a great thing to like use real time in the office. And one of my favorite tools, and we use this with adults too in criminal justice, that people who present with that wall of words, right? Like they just have no interpersonal sense and they're just like a deluge of content, is that we use one of the handouts in John's book is like, has a stop sign on it. And so we actually tell the clinicians, like, it's like a visual sign, like, okay, now it's my turn to talk, right? It's like just that simple. And that's what you'll find in that book. Questions?
You've got 30 to 50% that are.
I totally missed it.
You have 30 to 50% of the, in the criminal system that are being identified.
Yep.
And we've got 500 or so kids being referred to us that are already identified.
Yeah.
And if I see, I don't know, if I've seen 100 kids in the last so many years, if I made an impact on 20 of those cases, then I feel fortunate.
Like you've made a whole career.
So we've got outcome studies, and we've got them coming from the CDC, and my fear is that, what is going to be judged worthy of funding?
Right. And here's what's interesting about your question, and I'm taking this a step further. So in the area where I'm doing research, the outcomes are not great. I mean, just from a pragmatic standpoint, they're not great, and they're super hard to measure. So we're looking now at the statewide judicial database and matching our 900 something people to the statewide database to look at current status, and did they unsuccessfully complete the requirements of their supervision? Did they successfully complete it? What do they have in common for the kinds of most recent arrest history and risk level at the time they were last assessed? And recidivism is imperfect, and is it rearrest? Is it reconviction, right? It's like a moving target. So that said, it's hard for us to measure it, but it's so much easier than what you're trying to measure. Does that make sense? So like downstream, it's like, do they stay out of jail? It's like the yes, no. But for you, the outcomes are so much more nuanced, right? This is, in some cases, working with kids, some of their deficits aren't even apparent when you meet them, right? Like they haven't even bumped into their injured frontal lobe when you see them when they're 10 years old, right? Like they won't actually look really impaired for another 10 years. So it's way harder to demonstrate tangibly that the work you're doing is making a difference. So I just want to appreciate that, because what's your outcome variable, right? Like, is it grades? Is it like some kind of peer rating of popularity? Like it's absurd. So it's really hard and is so much more important than the work we're doing downstream. So if there's anything that as a researcher I could be helpful brainstorming, because I would bet that the impact you have is immeasurable, and immeasurable, right? Like by definition, hard to measure.
And if you do get a variable, let's say it's 10%,
Yeah,
is that worthy of the funding?
right. It's hard to measure something that you're preventing from happening, right? Like it should be zero. Like, oh my God, 0 people killed themselves. Like, does that mean that you kept 70% from trying? Maybe, right? But it's immeasurable. Yeah, yep. So the measure is that they don't show up in my database or yours in Pennsylvania. We could do a little matching study, so at least you could have the rest assured that they're not really in there.
So something that I'm taking away from your talk is that we, as whether we're educators or on the brain staff's team, we have a student with a brain injury, whether it's concussion, moderate, severe, whatever it may be, it's important to teach them about what their strengths and deficit areas are, so that they understand that, no, you're not a bad kid. You misbehave because paying attention, or you're having a petit mal seizure or absence
Right.
seizure, and when you looked at your friend's paper to see where you were,
Yeah.
those kind of things. So teaching them about themselves,
Yeah.
making self-advocate could go a long way.
It's huge. It's totally huge. And this is, I mean, it goes without saying that you guys in the room understand kind of from a best practice standpoint. So it's gold standard documentation. So these are like the victories for you. So if you can establish a record of someone's injury, right? So there is an upside to like identification of traumatic brain injury, because then it makes it easier for them to access services they may be eligible for with the brain injury history. And you triage them as a bigger risk and needing more services, right? So that's ultimately a good thing. So brain injury documentation, academic scaffolding, so the cognitive piece, like how do I keep this kid afloat in a classroom? What kind of supports do they need? Then it's the kind of caregiver peer piece, right? How do I keep this person's support network afloat, right? And keep that viable. And then minimizing all the other risks. So recognizing like, hey, this kid's risk for self-harm is much higher. The risk for an actual diagnosable mental illness is higher. The risk for becoming a substance abuser while they're still in school is much higher. So, right, like working really hard to avoid all of the slippery consequences, like are probably the 4 biggest wins, and they're all squarely right in that wheelhouse.
What do you think about, because the big push for a while has been, you have one concussion, you recover, you're fine.
Yeah.
That's been something that we've trained on
Right.
years ago. But now, there is research coming out saying, even though you think you recovered, your white brain tracts
Right.
matter.
Yeah.
Still showing changes for a long while.
Yep.
So what do you think about concussions? If someone has recovered, a lot of the people maybe recovered from their concussions. Do you really think that that is connected on down the road, or do you? From what we are seeing in our data, these kids are having issues long term.
Sure.
But everyone's telling them once you're recovered, fine.
Right.
Football.
And we use self-report as the primary index for recovery, which is, a great piece of data. Should it be the only piece of data? Probably not, but we don't have a great biomarker yet. But your point about is self-report of being symptom-free, does that map onto any of the research that we have about biological indicators of injury? And it doesn't at all, right? So the first thing to recover is self-report. People describe themselves as symptom-free. For high school kids, it's like 7 days. For younger kids, it's like, I think junior high is like 14 days. And even if we look at just metabolites of injury, right, that's 30 days, 45 days for a second injury. So is there a way that we could create a system that scaffolds them for, let's say it's 45 days, even though they're like, I'm fine, but that at least keeps them from having a high stakes failure, right? So academically or socially, right? Like, okay, I believe you that you're fine, but let's just, right? Like, let's have some extra eyes on you to just make sure that this goes well.
Coming down the road, years later, spiking up.
Oh, years later after a single injury. That's a good question. And I made the point earlier, and I was thinking you meant like immediately post-acute, where we're like, you're good, right? Like, okay, no headache, okay, you're good. And that isn't a great marker of recovery from injury, right? And your vulnerability to really significant problems after a second injury could be much worse in that time. So the literature on the single uncomplicated mild injury, right? That soundbite, the talking point you hear is like, you recover fully to baseline after a single uncomplicated mild injury. And we do talk about that, and it's a good soundbite, especially for someone who is injured, right? To remind them, like, the data suggests that, you had a good brain going in and you're gonna have a great recovery. And recognizing that research on the 7 to 33%, or 1 to 33%, depending on who you listen to, is really complicated. I think we know very little about the people who don't recover fully, and it's not the norm, right? That's not the majority of the population, but there's something, is probably to a person, like every single person's injury is unique, your physiology is unique. There's factors around expectancy that make things even more complicated. Yeah, so your point is a really good one. In clinical practice, I talk about, I usually let people, I talk about like 3 freebies. So I see a lot of our college athletes, like they will tag me in for an athlete on their 4th injury. So like the coach is like, oh, they say they're symptom free, but then they'll send them to me just for a conversation. I'm like, listen, maybe you get 1 or 2 freebies, you kind of push your luck with a 3rd, but now the stakes are higher, right? Like now you're in the territory of like, could you play ultimate frisbee instead of girls lacrosse, right? Like maybe. So yeah, I don't think we know, I would say jack shit, if I weren't averse to swearing, about some people's recovery after even a single injury, right? Like we know only population norms, that most people get better, but for reasons we don't understand, some people don't. Yeah, and in clinical practice for me, 3 is like the point at which I'm like, man, I don't know about that. Like you get to make the call, right? Like you get to make that decision, but whew, like here's what I see at, injury 5 or 6 or 7 for college students is like, they don't even have a college career anymore.
I was gonna say, that goes back to two factors. You have the young child who is on playing football as a young child. Mom and dad are pushing, this is your only way out. You'll never get out of this.
Yeah.
Unless you go pro. Then they go to college, and they still push for themselves because they still want the out. So that self-reporting doesn't hold true because they're not gonna.
That's right. It's a really good point that those systems can disincentivize symptom reporting in a lot of ways, and that's true for cognitive testing, baseline cognitive testing. It speaks to the importance of adding effort tests, though, right? Like, what can I do to make sure I can flag when someone's throwing the test, right? So if they throw the baseline test, then it's a different conversation to have.
And adults do the same thing.
And adults do the same time. That's right. That was the research too. You guys, I appreciate the work that you're doing so much. I mean it. If there's anything at any point that I could ever do to facilitate your progress or help with a case or send along a resource, you have my contact information. You'll have printed or electronic copies of these materials. I want to thank you guys, especially all of you who hung in here for 4 hours of me. Hooray, you totally did it.